In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Dual Sword Duelist build. This is a build that focuses on using the Horned Warrior Sword and some unique properties of this weapon. I haven't made any builds in a good long time, but I thought with the Night Rain announcement, kind of inspired me a little bit. So let's get into how this build works. As I just mentioned, the weapon that we're using for this build is the Horned Warrior Sword. This is a curved sword, and there are some very, very unique things about this sword that make it very special, and the reason that I selected for this build. Firstly, it is a paired weapon. There have been a few curved swords that are paired added with the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, but this is one of them, and this allows you to use the weapon single-handed or both curved swords at the same time for much less weight. And in addition, it allows you to hold something in your offhand and get the effects while you're still two-handing if something has like a bonus feature, like adding, health back on kill or FP back on kill or something like that. So that is a very good strength of this weapon. Secondly, because it is a paired weapon, you can actually block using the L1 button with it, which is important for this build. You wouldn't think you'd be blocking with curved swords, but I'll get into why that's important in a minute. But the fact that you can block with a paired weapon is absolutely fantastic compared to using, two curved swords that are not paired, because then you cannot block. Thirdly, it does 100% physical damage, even though it has scaling with strength, dexterity, and faith, making it one of just a few weapons in the game that actually has faith scaling, but deals 100% physical damage. And lastly, its weapon skill, Horn Calling, deals 100% holy damage, which is great against enemies that are weak against holy damage. And typically what you find with weapons that have holy damage weapon skills is that a lot of the weapon damage is also holy, and some bosses and things can resist holy damage. So that's typically bad, but in this case, because the weapon itself does 100% physical damage and the weapon skill does 100% holy damage, you can use whichever damage type makes the most sense for what enemy or boss that you're facing. And Horn Calling is an absolutely devastating weapon skill when used properly, and it'll be primarily used out on the landscape or when in legacy dungeons. You don't tend to use it as much in boss fights. It really depends on the boss. Some bosses are aggressive. That prevents the use of this weapon skill. Others hang back a bit and you can use it. But where it really shines is out on the landscape when you're fighting groups of enemies, because it has such a good AoE radius, can be used at a safe distance, it has a relatively fast cast speed, and if you build properly, it can deal fantastic damage, often one-shotting a lot of enemies simultaneously, making like short work of just exploration in general. So in my offhand, one of my offhand slots, I'm using the Erdtree seal. That's because I have a lot of faith for this build. One of the great things about the way this weapon scales is that you can put a lot of points in faith and still get decent damage out of it. Dexterity scales much better than strength and faith does, but that's why we have a lot of dexterity in this build. But faith is probably second to that, and that allows you to actually create a build that you can use spell casting with if you have enough points, at least to some degree, right? Like, you're going to meet the requirements for some spells. You might not have the most damage when you're casting damaging spells, but that doesn't mean you can't still use them in pinches, or like if you know an enemy is specifically weak against fire, you can cast a fire incantation or lightning, something like that. You can add that into your build if you want. So we have this in our offhand, predominantly to use buffs like Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. That's predominantly we have it there for, so you want to make sure you have at least 25 faith in order to use both of those spells, because again, the weapon itself does 100% physical damage, so Flame Grant Me Strength is really good for that. And Golden Vow will buff not only your regular attacks, but also the weapon skill, even though it deals holy damage, so it's good for that as well. Now, if you really wanted to min-max this build, you could put something in your second backup slot in your offhand, like Sacrificial Axe or something like that, and then after you buff yourself, swap to the Sacrificial Axe and then start two-handing your curved swords in order to get like FP back when you kill something, or some other weapon that, provides some sort of benefit like that. You tend to go through a lot of FP when you're exploring from using Horn Calling, so I would recommend the Sacrificial Axe if you want, but there are certainly other options available to you as well. Now for armor, it's not super important what armor you use. I have led as armor for my chest piece simply because it increases the damage after rolling or sprinting. You tend to do that a lot in this game in general, particularly with curved swords, so that's really nice here. And the other pieces are just mainly for fashion, but I wanted to make sure I had at least 51 poise in order to not be interrupted with a single attack from an enemy or boss. So make sure you have at least 51 poise no matter what armor you're set up with. Now for talismans, there's a lot of great talismans for this build, and I typically mix up the talismans depending on what I'm doing. So when I'm exploring out on the landscape, I usually have Shard of Alexander slotted and Sacred Scorpion Charm slotted in order to boost the damage of Horn Calling, and I have Ritual Sword Talisman slotted for similar reason, because I'm trying to kill enemies at a distance with it, before they even get to me in order to damage me. So those are all really good. Crusade Insignia is also not bad, as that's going to increase your attack power after you kill something for a certain amount of time. So if you like kill a group of enemies with Horn Calling, then you quickly move to the next one, you'll have even more damage on those. So that can be really beneficial when you're exploring as well. Now in boss fights, I tend to mix things up a bit because you can't really use Horn Calling effectively in every boss fight. Some boss fights you can, and in those boss fights you might want to use some of these, minus Crusade Insignia obviously, in order to make sure that when you're hitting with Horn Calling you're doing a lot of damage, or you might want to like, mix and match Talismans. But generally in boss fights, I make sure I have at least the two-headed turtle talisman slotted, because I use a lot of stamina between dodging, attacking with dual wield, and also using Horn Calling. Horn Calling is like a stamina hog. So two-headed turtle talisman is almost a must for any boss fight if you're going to use this weapon skill at all. Other good options for talismans are Millicent's Prothesis, which gives you more damage the more you hit enemies, and also gives you extra dexterity. This weapon scales predominantly with dexterity, so that's a good addition. Rotten Winged Sword Insignia is also good for similar reasons, stacking up your attack power as you hit more and more. If you find you're doing less Horn Calling in a boss fight and more dual wield attacks, then that's a good one. Another good talisman for this build is a Curved Sword Insignia, which increases your block counter damage. You might be wondering why you'd be doing block counters with this build, but I'll get into that in just a second. And another one is also Blade of Mercy, which increases your damage after you're doing a critical strike. Because you do get block counters, you will stagger enemies regularly on the landscape, so that can also be a good one as well, or in boss fights as well. So this brings us to the Flask of Wonders Physique, and we're using the Green Burst crystals here in order to increase stamina recovery, because we just need stamina recovery. If you're out on the landscape exploring, you can switch this to like extra holy damage in order to make Horn Calling deal even more damage if you want. But in a boss fight, you're absolutely going to want this to be stamina recovery, because again, Horn Calling is very expensive stamina wise, and you are going to be dodging and attacking a lot with like huge combo chains. And the other one is the Deflecting Hard Tier. Now, the Deflecting Hard Tier is what really makes this build shine, in my opinion, what makes it kind of unique compared to other builds, because you're dual wielding a paired weapon that allows you to block, and then you can use the Deflect Hard Tier to block successfully if you can time your block properly, allowing you to stand toe-to-toe with bosses and difficult to kill enemies and block counter them and stagger them, get critical strikes on them, or just use your combos effectively. And you don't have to dodge as much when you can block, which is really great. So you're going to get the benefit of a shield here without having to have one, because you can block because of the paired weapon nature of this weapon. And I think this is what, again, kind of makes this unique. You can do this with other paired weapons as well if you want, but this is one that I did kind of around this weapon. So attribute-wise for this weapon, I have 50 Vigor, I have 31 Mind. You need quite a bit of Mind for this build, because you're going to use a lot of FP between using Horn Calling regularly, between buffing with Golden Vow, so every so often you're going to need a decent amount of FP, and you don't want to have to blue flask in boss fights any more than you have to. Endurance is really high for this build because, again, as I mentioned, Horn Calling is a stamina hog, and if you're using it at all in boss fights, which you will, you're going to eat up huge chunks of your stamina, and you want to make sure that you have a big pool so you can still attack or dodge if you need. Strength is at 14 for this build in order to meet the requirements for the weapon. Dexterity is the best scaling stat out of all three stats for this weapon, which is why I have the most here. It kind of tapers off after this point. You don't need any intelligence. I started as an astrologer, which is why that's so high, and then I have 40 faith here as well. Strength and faith scale about the same in my opinion, so you might as well take the faith option if you're trying to use incantations like Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and any other incantations you want. It just makes more sense in order to do it that way. And lastly, we have 9 Arcane, which you don't need any Arcane for this build unless you're trying to meet requirements for some incantations, which you can. Now, if you're talking about great runes for this build, Godric's is not a bad option. You need like 6 out of the 8 stats, which is usually the minimum I recommend for using that, which is good. Radon's is also not bad for more FP, HP, and stamina. All of those things are very, very valuable to this build, so I would highly recommend probably either one of those two. And lastly, one tip I'll just say is that if you like this play style and you like this build, but you're not in love with the weapon that we're using for this build, you could also try using the Fox Curved Swords for this, because this weapon has native bleed build up on it, which should make this build even more powerful in boss fights, but obviously it'll be a lot less useful outside of boss fights when you're exploring, because the weapon skill Revenger's Blade is, not Horn Calling in that regard. You can still use Revenger's Blade very successfully. It's not a bad weapon skill by any means, but it kind of changes the nature of the build, making it more effective in boss fights and less effective on the landscape. So if you're someone who struggles more with bosses and you want to be a bit more effective, you could use that weapon instead. So that wraps up our Dual Sword Duelist build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I think I'm probably going to do at least 1 or 2 more build guides over the holiday season for Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree, so stay tuned for those. We have more Path of Exile 2 content coming on the channel, including some more class guides if you've been enjoying that game. And we will have some surprises in January, so stay tuned for that.